Hello everybody and welcome to another amazing video of DIY investing. We are moments away from the biggest alt season and most importantly the biggest bull run that we're ever going to experience in crypto history. We have the perfect storm paired with a new all-time high in Bitcoin, Ethereum breaking out and erasing over 2 years of a correction, and we are also seeing Bitcoin dominance topping. At this exact same moment of time, the institutions are buying the dip, retail is getting ready to FOMO in at the top, and all of this is coming into the perfect head for the biggest explosion in price that we've ever seen. Today, I have some important charts that we're going to be breaking down, making sure that you guys know exactly what to expect moving forward from here. So guys, if you find any value in this video, please do me a favor, hit that like, comment, and subscribe button. Without further ado, let's jump right into this amazing video today. Alrighty everybody, here we are jumping into today's video, and I wanted to start this out by taking a look at a tweet that I made March 4th at the beginning of this year, and I wanted to talk a little bit about what's happened with Ethereum since I made this tweet. And the whole point I ever ended up covering this, I first covered it on Twitter, and then I ended up bringing it over to YouTube, and I made a number of different updates around this V-bottom. And almost exactly every cycle, I've always seen Ethereum just follow the same cycle that Bitcoin did ahead of it. And, Ethereum really just kind of syncs up with Bitcoin because of so much of the liquidity being kind of bonded together. Bitcoin's the rising tide that lifts all ships, and with Ethereum being the second in command, it has such a similar price correlation with Bitcoin, and that was really what I was seeing unfold at the beginning of this year when we were having that big sell-off and ETH was capitulating under $1,500. Now, what I talked about was how the price looks identical to Bitcoin in its last cycle, and I was expecting a bear trap before a V-bottom. And if we come in here, ETH ended up capitulating all the way here at about $1,400, just a little bit under the $1,500 mark, and it was very similar to what Bitcoin did in the COVID capitulation. And that was the whole point that I was trying to make. The whole reason I was trying to cover that was because I knew that this was going to be another type of capitulation that if anybody sold, you'd really regret it because of how intense the upswing would be. Now, don't get me wrong, guys, when we're looking at Ethereum, and comparing it to Bitcoin's last cycle, Bitcoin pretty much rallied into resistance, and then it corrected, and then it went like this before it ever broke out. So it spent, quite a few months consolidating before it ever got to the point of breaking out. Whereas Ethereum, if we're looking at this currently today, and we kind of look at this descending resistance that we had, we confirmed the breakout on this weekly close. Even though we had this big red day, having this giant bullish engulfing candle that immediately followed, that shows that, the market was respecting that breakout, and they do believe that it held. And so now that we're seeing, Ethereum all the way back up here near the all-time highs, we're pretty much at the highs that Bitcoin was at when everything topped at 65K. We're just barely under the prior all-time high at about 48, 4,900, depending on where you're looking at it. So when we're looking at this, seeing Ethereum up at this high price point, I do believe that we're moments away from really getting that true liftoff that we'd all been talking about. Now, when I'm covering the Ethereum chart, like I stated at the beginning of this video, the whole point and the reason why I was comparing it to Bitcoin is because if we come over in here, I've drawn the comparison a million times for you guys. We don't need to get into a ton of detail, but I've always been talking about why I believed that this was more or less kind of that same sort of consolidation. And what I mean by that, this little rounded bottom that comes in here, it rallies up into resistance. You get kind of this triangular topping pattern that forms right in here. It falls back down to support, bounces, and then rejects, gets a false breakout, and then that's what led us into that final capitulation right there. And that was the whole thing that I was drawing with Ethereum, telling you guys that we need to buy the dip, we need to keep DCAing because this is a really great buying opportunity, and it was. Looking back on it in hindsight, we're looking at many NFTs at basically CryptoPunks being worth 20 Ethereum when Ethereum was only worth like $1,400. So there was insane life-changing opportunities scattered throughout. It's just that most people were too afraid to actually buy that. However, guys, it was the same way in the COVID capitulation. And I would argue that it was actually a little easier to buy the COVID capitulation. For me, it was anyways, because, I woke up and all of a sudden Bitcoin had a 50% red candle. So that's almost like that's never happened, right? And it was in a bull market too. So even though Bitcoin had basically fully retraced this move, it was still holding higher highs. And I looked at that as more of an obvious capitulation, right? The whole market corrects 50% in a day. Some altcoins were correct 70, 80% in that one day. So that's a more obvious buy opportunity. ETH capitulating from 4,100 and kind of just doing it in a lot of these like smaller candles rather than just one big red one, it was a little bit more intimidating, and we saw a lot more lower lows and lower highs, and it was a little bit more brutal. So most people weren't anticipating any sort of big reversal, but it was the same way back over here with Bitcoin. Nobody expected that Bitcoin was just going to V-bottom and instantly break out of that downtrending resistance. But if we look right here, it's the exact same thing that Ethereum did today. So what I'm looking for now is really just this next big breakout. And one of the things that I want to basically map out for you guys is comparing our fib targets and looking at potential topping points that we could be experiencing for where we could actually look to take a little profit on our long-term holdings, or where we should be looking to actually scale out. You know, we're already following the 4-year cycle. We're already knowing that at the end of this year, that's our shifting point. However, when you're mapping out a 4-year cycle, the one thing that does change from cycle to cycle is the tops, right? You're analyzing a 4-year cycle from peak low of the bear market to the next peak low of the following bear market. So when you're doing that type of analysis, it's important to understand that there can be, you know, maybe a month or two of a difference between cycle to cycle. And that's what's the one variable that can change. The thing that shouldn't change is the peak low of the bear market to the peak low. That's always 4 years in between. But one of the other things that we can look to target outside of just time frames, we can look at targets through Fibonacci. And this trend-based fib tool is a really good way to basically map out where a potential top can be. If we analyze from the very low of the Bitcoin cycle of 2016 and 17, go to the peak at 20K, and all the way back down to the 2018 bear market, this will give us our targets for the next cycle. And if we notice, we have the 1618 here at about 34.5. We have the 2618 up here at about 55 abouts. And then we have the 3618 up here at about 74.5. So we didn't quite rally all the way up to that threshold of the 3618, but we were really close to it. We ended up peaking a little bit higher than the 2618 and more in between the 2618 and the 3618. Sometimes you'll see cycles and they'll just get so overextended they'll blow past all of their fib targets. So it's not like there's some exact method for being able to gauge. Same thing with time frames. You know, time frames are going to get us into the relative point where we know, you know, if the market's up at this time frame, we should be taking profits. But that's all we can really do. It's not like somebody has this crystal ball that's going to tell you the exact top of every cycle and the exact bottom. Although I will say that the one crystal ball that I think is the most effective is pretty much the 4-year cycles. But that's gauging from bear market low to bear market low. It doesn't really factor in the tops as much. So that's the one variable that can be shifty. Now, when we're looking at Ethereum, you know, we had this same cycle, right? Ethereum just followed what Bitcoin did in its last bull market. And if we can compare it to what Bitcoin did in its last cycle, then maybe we end up seeing something similar. Maybe ETH ends up peaking somewhere around the 3618 or the 2618. Who knows? Maybe ETH gets overextended because we don't have COVID, we don't have all this hyperinflation, and we have institutions buying in Ethereum at the same time. Maybe that's what gets a really overextended cycle for ETH. We don't really know, and I think that the best strategy moving forward from here is just simply identifying key targets on the chart and, you know, understanding that our 4-year cycles are looking like we're approaching somewhat of a cycle top at the ending of this year. You know, that's based off of all of our cycles, really. We've always followed a similar trend. Is this the year it shifts? You know, a lot of people have been talking about, because there's institutional involvement, that this is the cycle where it just kind of keeps running and it follows what the stock market did, where all of these stock charts just kept going and going. I disagree to that outcome, although I do think that we could run a little bit into 2026, maybe like February, March at the latest. That's kind of my only other scenario that I'm looking for when we're talking about this cycle. And I think that ultimately the reason why would just be we have a little bit more euphoria from the institutional demand, from the retail and stuff like that. You know, it has been a little bit late for us, you know, before we're really rallying into a new all-time high compared to some of the other cycles, but really we're still in the same 4-year time frames. Nothing's changed that much. We are just lagging maybe the last cycle, and we're right there with the 2017 time frames about. So, you know, realistically, when we're watching how this cycle could play out, maybe because it's already, you know, halfway through 2025, maybe we end up running throughout the rest of this year and maybe a couple months into 2026. But really, I'm still looking to scale out at the end of this year. You know, if I hold anything into 2026, it's going to be a smaller portion of my portfolio, because I still think we're better off getting in at a relative high point than we are trying to say, well, I know where the exact top is, I'm going to sell the exact top. And, you know, most people just don't do that. So So when I'm trying to play it safe, I look at these things. I'm looking at the time frames. We know at the end of the year. Okay, well, that's easy. Now, I'm also looking at the fib targets. Well, if ETH follows what Bitcoin did in the last cycle, we're pretty much looking over here at the 1618 being $8,600 per ETH. The 2618 is going to be up here at about $13,500. And then if we rally all the way up to the 3618, you know, that's going to be $18,000. So the potential of Ethereum rallying all the way up here to about 20 grand, I think is actually likely. I would say anywhere from 15 to 20 grand. That's my personal target. That's where I think that ETH has a very fair value of hitting as far as talking about, you know, a peak euphoric topping point. I think that that's a really good value that I'm looking to target. But when we were all the way back down in here, that's, you know, pretty much the same target I had. I've been talking about 20K Ethereum since, you know, pretty much the beginning and the ending of our bear market, right? So I'm always looking at the same price target, but when I'm really comparing it to Bitcoin, and I think now more than ever, we have a very real potential of ETH peaking somewhere inside of these sort of fib target extensions. And, you know, if maybe we get the really crazy euphoric blow off top that blows everybody's expectations, where we have a ton of companies looking to accumulate Ethereum, looking to earn that yield, looking to boost their stock share value and things like that. You know, ultimately, what if it hits the 4618? That would be 22 or 23,000. In my eyes, man, $30,000 seems really unrealistic to me, but man, I was in the 2017 cycle and I have seen really crazy things. So, you know, it's really easy to get PTSD based off of the last cycle. We like to focus on, you know, the most recent experience that happened to us and kind of ignore some of the previous ones. And most people just weren't around in 2017 to trade with anyways. So most people's first cycle was kind of the last bull market. And if that's the case, you know, your only perception is always going to be comparing it and judging it and contrasting it to what happened in the last bull market. But the variables were so different, right? We didn't have real institutional involvement. You know, retail did kind of show up, but a lot of the money going into Bitcoin was just kind of smart money in general, kind of jumping in when they cut interest rates and started printing a bunch of money. So a lot of that, in my opinion, was amplified just because of, you know, the stimulus that took place. When we're looking at this cycle, we didn't have stimulus. We didn't have, you know, we didn't have a giant virus taking over the world and things like this. We didn't have all of this stuff going on. And so now that we have real institutional involvement, it's looking like this cycle more than ever is going to have a true blow-off top in similar ways that 2017 was when we're looking at Bitcoin and the way that that market cycle looked, just extreme upside gains, especially when we're talking about the blow-off top from 3,000 to 20,000 in about 2 months. That's pretty gnarly. So when we're looking at Ethereum today, don't be surprised if the institutional cycle gets a little overextended and really kind of takes people by surprise, especially if we end up seeing Ethereum really start breaking out quick over here. Maybe ETH runs all the way to the 1618 in the first move, and if that's the case, you know, we can see this thing really start to pick up in a really big way and start to extend, you know, pretty much over this $20,000 level. If we're talking ETH having an extreme euphoric cycle, it is definitely possible that we could overextend the fib targets. But I'm still 1,000% betting more on the idea of a 15 to 20K ETH. I'm looking to take my profits in that range. If it goes higher, if it doubles again and I look like an idiot, you know, ultimately I'm still making profits, so you can't feel too bad about that. And that's what I think is most important. Ultimately, when we're looking at ETH BTC, it's moments away from breaking out. Once ETH BTC breaks out, that's really where true alt season takes place. Yes, we've seen Bitcoin dominance kind of topping, but this chart needs to break out. We need to get back above this 0.404 level. And once that happens, I think it's going to be a pretty quick buyback as ETH runs something like this into a new all-time high. It'll be a really quick cycle. I don't think that ETH is going to mess around. I think that it's going to really start to just pump in similar ways that it always really has when it starts to outperform Bitcoin. You know, the peaks happen in a relatively short period of time, and I do anticipate that it will be mostly the same going into this cycle once more. But this is really the chart we need to focus on. If ETH starts outperforming Bitcoin and breaks out, that's the go-ahead for true alt season. That's where everybody's going to be going on-chain. They're going to be buying these altcoins. They're going to be trading NFTs and all of that type of stuff. You know, coming over here, once again, looking at Bitcoin dominance is confirming our breakdown. You know, what I was talking about in my live stream, if you tuned in for that, or, you know, the last few videos I've been covering, we rejected, confirmed the lower high. Now we have this big bearish engulfing candle that is followed through right here. In my eyes, this is setting in for another drop, probably all the way down to about 54% dominance. We might see a bounce off of that level. Or if we don't bounce off that level, I wouldn't be surprised if this thing starts to really fall all the way back down to that 51, 52, to maybe even that 50% region before any sort of meaningful bounce sets in. Regardless of all of that, guys, this thing is in a downtrend. We're going to continue to see this thing break down, and I think that the main target should obviously be this 40% region. We can still make a lower low. We can still break down from this same region, maybe make a new all-time low from 35% in 2017. But I think that the best way to really gauge when the shifting point could be or a bounce is once we hit this 40% region. We could see a bounce off this. Could be a big washout for altcoins. Maybe that sets us in for one more kind of capitulation like that. I don't know. But this is more or less what I'm anticipating. So now that we're just at that point where it's shifting, I think we've got a lot of really good things to look forward to, guys. 15 to 20K ETH, I think, is a given this cycle. When we're comparing it to Bitcoin in the last cycle, if Bitcoin can do all of that, even with all of that negative stuff happening in the economy, I think ETH in the institutional cycle can even do more than that. So, if Bitcoin's hitting all the way up here at the 3618, maybe we see over a $20,000 Ethereum. Maybe it's like 23, 24, 25. Who really knows? But I'm excited to trade it. Let me know what your guys' thoughts and perception is in the comments below. I want to know what you guys think ETH is going to. How long do you think it's going to take? You think that we're going to run in 2026? You guys think that we're going to top at the end of the year? Drop your comments below. I'd love to hear those. With that being said, thank you so much for tuning in. If you want to see anything I'm buying, selling, trading over this cycle, links are in the description. Go ahead and sign up on my website. Get access to those signals. See anything that we're going to be doing over this market cycle, because I'm telling you guys, there's going to be an insane amount of profit. I'm telling you, this is probably the most profitable one ever, and I think it's all just because of the coming retail and all of the institutional FOMO that we're already kind of starting to see. So guys, if you found any value in this video, do me a favor, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. With that being said, I'll catch you guys in the next one. As always, peace out.